Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Garrity of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. And Jim, we start with the Washington Post in our good martini today because they're actually dealing it straight when it comes to some crazy ideas being thrown out there from one of the leading Democratic presidential candidates. That would be Kamala Harris, Democrat senator from California. She tweeted out 3 days ago, the average tax refund is down about $170 compared to last year. Let's call the president's tax cut what it is, a middle-class tax hike to line the pockets of already wealthy corporations and the 1%. Now, over at Hot Air, Ed Morrissey has been looking at this. He says Washington Post fact-checker Glenn Kessler branded this hot take as nonsensical and misleading, awarding Harris the full 4 Pinocchios. Yes, the tax refund average has dropped, but that's because 4 out of 5 earners did not update their W-4 for withholding after the tax cuts took effect as they were warned to do. Even with that aside, tax refunds don't reflect tax liability. The point of the tax cuts isn't to end up with big refunds. It's to pay less in taxes. And that's what happened with the tax cuts enacted in December. If you cut over to Glenn Kessler's piece, he says the Joint Tax Committee and the Tax Policy Center, which is clearly not a conservative outlet, took a look at this and found that 80.4% of all taxpayers would have a tax cut compared with about 5% experiencing a tax increase. In the middle quintile, 91% would get a tax cut, averaging about $1,090, with 7.3% facing a tax increase, averaging about $910. And so Cato Institute figures out that if you exclude payroll taxes, which weren't touched in this, folks in the middle class got a pretty nice tax cut. So, Jim, what do you make of the math, and what do you make of Harris trying to spin what's not true here?
Sure. Well, I guess the first thing is I remember a couple of years ago, it was either the Hill or CQ or Roll Call, some Capitol Hill-focused publications called up every office of the House and Senate and said, does the congressman or senator do his own taxes, or does he hire someone else to do it for him? And they collected as many answers as they could. I'm struck by the sheer number of people who talk about taxes and who don't really understand them. Now, look, I'll admit I don't understand the tax code as much as I wish I did or should. My dad, the accountant, is probably yelling at his computer right now as I say this. But it's a recognition that, like, okay, what you withhold each month, you don't want to, pay no taxes all year round and then all of a sudden get a bill that's, 5 figures, like, oh my goodness, I owe all these stuff. So usually your employer, or if you are self-employed, you end up sending in quarterly checks to the government so you don't owe this big chunk at the end of the year. You have it withheld. And then at the end of the year, they calculate your taxes. Either you do it yourself, maybe you use TurboTax, maybe you have your accountant doing it for you. You put it all together and they say, okay, this is how much we've calculated you owe. Now let's look at how much you paid over the course of the year. And if the amount you paid over the course of the year, well, that's why you get the refund. Yay! Now, folks on the right have long argued you shouldn't be that excited about your tax refund, because basically what it means is you gave the government an interest-free loan of all that money for the entirety of the year, and now the government is giving that money back to you. Most people like having that refund check at the end of April. The last thing you want is to actually owe taxes. You may recall when the tax cut passed, Greg, there were all these people saying, oh my God, I just ran the numbers and my taxes are going to go up so much. Now, it's not impossible that your taxes would go up from compared to the old tax system to the ones passed by Congress in 2017, but it's a really rare set of circumstances. I think my favorite was USA Today running the numbers of saying that if you had $1 million in income but did not own any property, which is probably a pretty rare setup, and you were single, no children, taking no deductions for anything like that, and there's like one or two other things, then you would end up with a slightly higher tax bill. I remember some people lamenting this. And I remember, again, not being an accountant, but just kind of saying, like, one of the big issues we've talked about on this podcast a couple of times was the cap on the state and local tax deduction, capped it at $10,000. That's not going to hit most people. But if you live in New York or California or Illinois or New Jersey or some of these other really high local and state tax states, maybe it is going to hit you. But on the other hand, you're getting a federal tax, you're getting lower rates on your federal taxes. So it should either balance out. you'd have to have a really rare set of circumstances in which you have relatively low income, but maybe if you owned a ton of property and you had to pay a lot of property taxes each year, maybe that would come out. I remember having this interaction with a woman on Twitter, and she's like, "No, it's really going to hit me. It's really going to hit me." And I'm like, "Really? How much you know?" She said, "Yeah, every year I have to deduct $30,000 to $40,000 in property taxes." Wow. I said, "Look, if you don't mind my asking, this is a really rare set of circumstances. Let's just say she was making mid six figures. Now, this woman, I feel bad for her. I'm sure she's upset about paying more in taxes because of this, but." Greg, when you're making mid six figures, I don't mean six figures like you hit $100,000. I mean, she was in the neighborhood of $500,000 a year. I don't think that can count as a tax hike on the backs of the middle class. I think when you're making $500,000 a year, you're not in the middle class anymore. And so I felt, now again, maybe this woman's run the numbers here. It's conceivable that some people are going to end up paying more. But like I said, it's a really rare set of circumstances. And oh, by the way, you can adjust the numbers a little bit by writing a check to a charity. Various other little things you can do to lower your tax burden here and there, including things that we're not such big fans. I guess, is the electric car tax credit still around? Because at that point you get like $7,000 tax credit or something like that. So anyway, the point is, do your taxes, compare your numbers from this year to last year. I think most people can look at this and say, hey, this turned out to be a really good deal for it. And you should not mistake your withholding versus and your rebate versus your overall tax bill.
Well, excellent point. And I'm also glad to see the Washington Post actually dealing straight on this, because a few days ago I was reading one of their stories where they were highlighting people who were very frustrated that they weren't getting bigger refunds. They had plans of what to do with the refunds they were expecting, and now they can't do them. And they were having these typical middle-class families. One's a first responder, one's a teacher. I think the couple they profiled was in New Jersey. This 13-paragraph article. And until you got to paragraph 11 or 12, they were just talking about how horrible this is. And then in 11 or 12, it says, actually, they are getting a lower tax bill overall.
Minor detail.
Thanks for burying the lead. All right, let's move on to our bad martini today, Jim. And this is going to be a rare event here on the 3 Martini Lunch. Usually I get a little squeamish when the clips get longer than a minute. This one's going to be 4 minutes, 18 seconds, because it's the entire line of questioning yesterday between Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She's been talked about a lot here and many other places in the past several weeks. And Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams was a State Department official back in the 80s. He was very focused on freedom in Central and Latin America, in El Salvador, as well as Nicaragua at the time, which is how he got caught up in the Iran-Contra investigation. And ultimately, as you'll hear the Congresswoman say, he ended up pleading guilty to a couple of things. Well, he later worked for the George W. Bush administration with the National Security Council, and now he's back with the Trump administration with a focus on what's going on in Venezuela. So here's Ilhan Omar, first of all starting off by calling him Mr. Adams instead of Mr. Abrams, and the confrontation just proceeds from there. Take a listen.
Mr. Adams, in 1991, you pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I can respond to that.
It wasn't a question.
That
was not a question. I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
Committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
That was not a question. Thank you for your participation. On February 8th, 1982, you testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about U.S. policy in El Salvador. In that hearing, you dismissed as communist propaganda report about the massacre of El Mozote, in which more than 800 civilians, including children as young as 2 years old, were brutally murdered by U.S.-trained troops. During that massacre, some of those troops bragged about raping a 12-year-old girl before they killed them. Girls before they killed them. You later said that the U.S. policy in El Salvador was a fabulous achievement. Yes or no, do you still think so?
From the day that President Duarte was elected in a free election to this day, El Salvador has been a democracy. That's a fabulous achievement.
Yes or no, do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and
yes or no?
No.
I will take that as a yes.
I am not going to respond to that kind of personal attack, which is not a question.
Yes or no, would you support an armed faction within Venezuela that engages in war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, if you believe they were serving U.S. interest, as you did in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua?
I am not going to respond to that question. I'm sorry. I don't think this entire line of questioning is meant to be real questions, and so I will not reply.
Whether under your watch, a genocide will take place, and you will look the other way because American interests were being upheld, is a fair question. Because the American people want to know that anytime we engage a country, that we think about what our actions could be and how we believe our values are being furthered. That is my question. Will you make sure that human rights are not violated and that we uphold international and human rights?
I suppose there is a question in there, and the answer is that the entire thrust of American policy in Venezuela is to support the Venezuelan people's effort to restore democracy to their country. That's our policy.
I don't think anybody disputes that. The question I had for you is that does the interest of the United States include protecting human rights and include protecting people against genocide?
That is always the position of the United States.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Jim, she could be in the bad or the crazy martini pretty much every day based on her track record so far. The best part, and I think folks heard you chuckling in the background, is when she asked him if a massacre by U.S. trained forces in El Salvador was considered a great achievement. He said no, and she'll take that as a yes. And so just on and on and on. It's obvious from watching it, probably more so than listening to it, that pretty sure she didn't write the copy there for those questions or her diatribe. But the fact that she's on this Foreign Relations Committee is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, look, I understand folks on the right getting extraordinarily upset about this Congresswoman. I can understand the amount of tension being given to her. I can understand the people who argue she does not belong, not on this committee and arguably not in Congress. But let's face it, Greg, we're not dealing with the sharpest knife in the drawer. Right? This isn't out of fear, right, of her, wicked wit and encyclopedic knowledge of United States foreign policy. Like, fairly obviously, she's got these questions in front of her, and she knows how to do the high dudgeon routine. I know she's bad, but you can tell, like, she hasn't even done the Cliff's Notes versions of U.S. policy in Central America during the Reagan administration. First of all, if you're fooling yourself into saying, Daniel Ortega was the good guy. No, take a look at his record. But yeah, there's a lot of strong moments. But I guess I'll begin by being the nicest thing I can say, Greg, about the Congresswoman. The fact that she calls him Adams instead of Abrams is probably the strongest argument against her being anti-Semitic. She moved from, but not only did she get his name wrong, she got his name wrong in the less Jewish-sounding name. Basically, her arguments are you pro-massacre, sir? as if he's going to say yeah. But the second thing, as you point out, like, all of these, not just at one point, like, she says, I basically have no reason to believe you because of the Iran-Contra thing. No, she's free to have that opinion. It is something to just berate the witness and then not ask any questions. And when he decides to object and when he decides to say, well, actually, here, I'm going to tell you, you just called him a liar, and you're going to deny him the opportunity to respond to the accusation. The moment, no, I will take that as a yes. Great, that's right out of Veep. You talk about lines I wish I had written in the Weed Agency. That is right up there. And basically another question basically amounts to, are you pro-war crime? Even if Abrams was pro-war crime, do you think he's going to say so? Right? I mean, this isn't even good demagoguery. This is like bargain basement demagoguery. And also, let's not forget that on the issue of Venezuela, she points to past cases where the U.S., let's face it, the Contras did not have a sterling human rights record. There were no pure good guys in Central America in the 1980s. The question is, did you like the ones that were technically fighting on the side of liberty and democracy and anti-communism? Or did you like the shady guys who are on the side of communism? And those were our bad options there. This congresswoman is on the pro-dictator, pro-ongoing human rights abuses side and the pro-famine side, right? So, in Venezuela, this is not a hard choice in Venezuela. But if there was some sort of violent insurgency in Venezuela that was committing human rights abuses on a massive scale, yeah, this would be a different decision. We could very much, it's very possible to look at a foreign policy fight and say, you know what, neither one of these guys are good guys. Neither one of these guys are acting in adherence with American values. That's not what's happening here in Venezuela. And I just think it's really fascinating that, of all the regimes you could feel great sympathy towards, I think it says a great deal that she's running to the ramparts to defend the regime in Venezuela.
All right, let's move on to our crazy martini now, Jim. And I guess on one level, you got to give Nancy Pelosi a molecule of credit. She's clawed her way back into power after being in the minority for 8 years. And as soon as she gets there, she's got to deal with the wingnuts of this new freshman class. She had to smack down Omar for the anti-Semitism. I think she tried to dismiss Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as politely as possible by calling it the Green Dream or whatever. And making it clear that she doesn't think this is something the Democrats should be spending a whole lot of political capital on. Over on the Senate side, however, the leader of that chamber is more than happy to talk about the Green New Deal. That would be Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who says, okay, you people want this so much, let's bring it to a vote, which I think shocked a number of Democrats, including the guy who wrote the Senate bill. That would be Ed Markey of Massachusetts, who is now furious with Mitch McConnell for having a vote on this. 2 tweets from Senator Markey. Don't let Mitch McConnell fool you. This is nothing but an attempt to sabotage the movement we are building. He wants to silence your voice so Republicans don't have to explain why they are climate change deniers. McConnell wants this to be the end. This is just the beginning. This isn't a new Republican trick. By rushing a vote on the Green New Deal resolution, Republicans want to avoid a true national debate and kill our efforts to organize. We're having the first national conversation on climate change in a decade. We can't let Republicans sabotage it, unquote. So, Jim, a lot to potentially unpack in there, but essentially Ed Markey knows he's going to lose, and he's going to lose badly, and so he's trying to buy some time here, which I'm not sure would help him anyway.
Yeah. How dare you bring this legislation to the floor? That we're like, wait, I thought that's what you guys wanted him to do. So, typically, we've warned many times on this podcast, Greg, why people should not mess with Cocaine Mitch. This is kind of the classic, strategy. And Democrats, if they're wiser, would kind of think through and say, okay, our base wants things that are not necessarily going to play well when we face the electorate. That basically this is the sort of things that would be tougher to sell in a general election. We're going to need to kind of be a little more modest, be a little more careful, make sure we don't frighten people that we're going to end up taking away something they really like or really care about, i.e. airplanes, meat, 88% of their current form of electricity. We need to make sure that, our plan doesn't sound like sustenance farming, okay? Ideally, you would not write any of this stuff down, or you'd minimize how much of it is written down. And it's worth noting, the resolution that was introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her colleagues in the House is a resolution, meaning it's not a piece of legislation. What it means is, it's basically, this is the sense of the House, we should do this. Doesn't go into a lot of details about how they should do it. It's worth noting that, yes, technically cow farts are not in there. That was part of the frequently asked questions sheet that was put out by her office, and that they suddenly said, no, we totally didn't mean to do that. That was a draft. It's not in the final version, et cetera, et cetera. When people say, it's not in the legislation, well, yeah, one, because the resolution has almost no real detail to it. It's a to-do list. It's not a plan, right? If the next thing is you have to recognize all of you like a good chunk of the Democrats in the Senate are running for office. I'm going to use one gentle anecdote. It's Valentine's Day. I'm going to refer to Mrs. Campaign Spot here. She's like, so how was your day? I'm like, well, let me tell you about Kirsten Gillibrand. She's like, oh yeah, you told us about her. She's, she stood up for tomato paste, and she's otherwise considered this nice lady. I'm like, no, honey, that's Senator Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota who's running for president. My wife is a very smart woman. My wife is fairly well attuned to what's going on in politics. She can't keep all the Democratic senators running for president straight, right? So my guess is the average voter is probably going to have these, start mixing these people up. You got a lot of Democrats, and they're all going to try to outbid each other, running further to the left. So if you're Nancy Pelosi, or if you're Chuck Schumer, you don't want your whole caucus voting on this. Let them do that. You want to keep what's going on in the presidential campaign trail and what's going on in the Senate as separate as possible, because most of those people running for office who are running for president, the Cory Bookers, the Klobuchars, the Gillibrands, the Kamala Harrises, look, New Jersey, New York, Minnesota, California, if you're an incumbent Democratic senator in most of these states, you're probably going to be fine, right? You can afford to go far to the left. You got to go really far to the left before you start endangering your reelection. And a bunch of these folks just got reelected in the last cycle or two. But for the rest of them, including the ones who are up in 2020, this is not such an easy vote. And all of a sudden, this starts coming into a situation where it's either you irk the base by saying, well, actually, no, I can't sign on to the Green New Deal. Or you do sign on, and all of a sudden the National Republican Senatorial Committee is doing a little dance because now they've got fodder for ads for the rest of the year. Senator so-and-so, who probably flies on private jets a lot, wants to take away your right to get on an airplane, stuff like that. So they walked right into this. It's, Markey's complaint. How dare they? This is a bad faith. Really, no kidding. This is what you do in politics. If your opponent says, I stand for X, you make them vote for X, and you see whether they really mean it. Advocates of the Green New Deal should love this, because actually what it's doing is it's separating the fake supporters, the inauthentic supporters, from the ones who really mean it. And, I think moments like that are clarifying, Greg.
Oh, it's fascinating. Yeah, apparently Amy Klobuchar has already said that she's going to vote for it, but she sees it as aspirational and symbolic, even though in the Senate, I don't think that's actually not the way it is, but that's the way she's spinning it.
Aspirational and symbolic, much like her presidential campaign.
Crazy Democrats. They're going to keep us...
We got lots of material. Here's the upside of that not so great midterm, Greg. Plenty of material.
Yeah. We're not running out anytime soon. Jim, the good news is tomorrow really is Friday. See you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Columbus of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.